All right, the recording has started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Nolan. This is SAC Interactive. We meet here every third Wednesday of the month at 6:30 p.m. California time. The talks are always free and always welcome to everyone who would like to join us. The topic is something to do with web or mobile development. The actual technology we use changes from month to month, but it's always something in the web or mobile development kind of space. We are always looking for new presenters. If you would like to present to the group sometime, please drop me a message. We're also always looking for new subjects on which to present. So if you have an idea for a talk that you'd like to see someone else present later on, please drop me a message and we'll see what we can do about adding that to the calendar. If you would like to be on our mailing list so we can let you know about upcoming meetings, you can just send me a message in the chat for today and I'll add you to the list. You can also go to sacinteractive.com and send a message there and be added to our mailing list as well if you'd like to do it that way instead. Today we've got Corbin here, who has been very kind enough to come back yet again and give another presentation for the group. He's been here, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 times already, I think. And Corbin's going to talk about building a framework agnostic library for us today. I'm very excited. I saw part of this talk previously at another meetup, and I got there late because traffic was stupid and parking was stupider. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing the whole thing in its entirety today. From you, Corbin. The floor is yours, my friend. Take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. All right, y'all. So today I'm going to be talking about our library TanStack Form. Okay, you're seeing the right screen. Good stuff. So first, let me give an intro to what TanStack Form is. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the challenges of building a framework library is. Some of those challenges. And then I'm going to talk about how you can build a framework agnostic library and some of those challenges. And then we're going to talk about how TanStack Form specifically builds a framework agnostic library. So TanStack Form is a competitor to Formic, React Hook Form, similar. The idea is that it is a form validation library that allows you to do client-side validation on your forms, right? So like if I go look at our examples, we can see that we support both React and Vue today. Soon there will be another one in this list. But the very basics look something along the lines of this, where you have a form that's defined as use form. You pass it some default values, and then that's it. Like that's 100% of the setup that you need to do. You then create a provider, and inside the provider, you have a field with a name. So if I try to typo this, it'll warn me and say, hey, there is no ASDF, like you need to have first name, last name. So we're type strict. We then pass an on-change validation. So we can say something like, hey, your name needs to be more than 3 characters, or you need to have a first name at all. We also support asynchronous validation. So basically every 500 milliseconds, run this asynchronous, like maybe this is a fetch request of some kind, but we do have an async validation. Then we have the rendering. So here we're saying that we have a label for first name and some text input that updates the value stored within the form. And then we have the ability to subscribe to very localized state, something I'll touch on in a second. And that'll tell us whether we can submit and whether we are actively submitting. We also just added a new feature literally last night, which is support for Yep and Zod. So if you're using either of those libraries, all you need to do is add a validator. So we are validator agnostic. You can add whatever validators you want, whether that's Valbot in the future or Yep or Zod. And you add your validator, and then suddenly you can use z.string.min or create a schema and say something along the lines of like schema equals z.object first name. And now you can use that schema in here by doing schema.shape first name. Right, so lots of flexibility. Our API also allows us to be able to have on change and on blur, as well as on submit and a few others. So the idea is that you can really get fine-grained with how exactly you want your validation to run and what errors exactly you want to display, right? So let's look at the simple example really quick, just to see that it actually executes. I'm going to cd into examples, React simple. We're going to run dev. And here we can see that first name has to be at least 3 characters. It has to be required. and it can't have the word error inside of it. Now I can validate and it'll submit to my console.log. And boom, there's the values I typed in. Pretty straightforward, right? So this isn't actually my first rodeo with forms. I actually originally wrote a library called House Form. And House Form was different in a few key ways from TanStack Form. First of all, it was React first, and React only. There was no other framework support. And second of all, it used a state that was stored inside the field instead of inside the form. So let's talk about what a controlled state versus uncontrolled state is. If I go to a example React project, I'm just going to do a JavaScript React project so we don't have to worry about TypeScript so much. If I have a field, right, and I say const field val set field val equals use state, we're going to say react.use state, and then here I'm going to have a form and an on submit. Actually, I need to prevent default first so that it doesn't refresh the page. And then we're going to have an input here with a value set to the field val and an on change event. And a button to submit the form. Here we go. All right. So now if I type some value and I hit submit, and I move this out of the way, you can see that there is ASDF law, whatever I typed in, right? But that's not really all that interesting. What I find more interesting is this idea that even outside of the form, right? Like we create a new div here and here. What I find interesting is that I can still see the value of the field outside of the field itself. Like this seems obvious, right? People that have used React for a long time have this idea of like life updating DOM, but think about what that entails. That means that the state has to be part of React in order for React to know, hey, I need this value stored here. So React does this by explicitly calling the set field value or the set state function as the second argument of use state, right? And whenever we update that value, it'll rerun this function, and this rerunning a function will do a diff of the before and after of the DOM. It'll reconcile what is different in the DOM, and then it'll patch the updates to try to be as localized as possible. So here it'll say like inner text node, go update that inner text node, right? And in fact, if I go look at a dummy play framework that I've built in the past, not the lovely Lane, fun framework. But what you can do is you can even see very specifically that you can do like a listener, right? And when you listen for values changing, you'll end up updating something like inner HTML or inner text or something akin to that, right? So under the hood, React's renderer is going in and updating inner text or some kind of API under the hood to be able to update the DOM, right? But it's only able to do that because it has reactivity, right? So what happens if we take React and we still store the value within React, but we don't tell it to re-render the value? Instead, we use something called useRef, right? So here, I'm going to say useRef.current field val.current equals that. So now if I type, it's not updating the value. We could remove values so that it's like just stored in the DOM now. The value is stored in React, but it's not re-rendering, so it's not showing up above. But when I hit submit, it still tracked the data, right? We could even go ahead and go so far as to move the state out of React and say something along the lines of like, let val equal an empty array. Actually, field val equal empty array. And now we can type and it's still tracked outside. Even though the state isn't tracked within React, we're still able to use JavaScript's scope behavior to be able to see what is inside and outside and so on and so forth, right? The only difference is that what's inside the function needs to be persisted using a use state or useref or whatever. So that's interesting. Like we have this ability to keep state outside of React and use it inside of React. But of course, if I needed to re-render for whatever reason, this value would be persisted between renders, which isn't ideal. You know, you want each instance of app to have its own version of field value, right? But we also just learned that we can keep state in React using uncontrolled state. And we can even keep state in React and re-render by using reactivity systems like the useState primitive. Now, React isn't the only framework in town, right? We also have, where is it? New project. Also have something like Vue, right? Or Angular. Let's talk about Vue for a second. So Vue, instead of useState, has something called ref. So here I'm going to say import ref from Vue. Sorry, I just realized this template does not have what I need. I need to go grab a new template. I wish StackBlitz's default template had what I was looking for. Right here. Okay. So now, if I go in here, I can move to script setup. I can say import ref from Vue. We'll still have all of this syntax or markup rather, but here we'll interpolate field value. We will say at submit instead of that. Input will be colon input. Change will be at change, although I think this also needs to be at input, but I'm going to make that change for now. Okay. So now I should be able to say const field val equals ref empty quote. And we'll create a field val, which takes in a value and says field val that value equals value. I'm going to refresh because it seems like our HMR broke, which is fine. But when all is said and done, we should be left with something that looks really familiar. Come on. Maybe? Yeah, there we go. Okay. So now I can still re-render, right? And of course it is at input, it's not at change. That's just a difference between HTML and React. So now if I submit, it should. Oh, that's because alert is technically not here. Here we go. Let's try that. There we go. Okay. So now we can see that it's rendering. We have the same behavior, but this looks a little different, right? Instead of explicitly changing or calling a function, we instead mutate the dot value function here, right? Or the dot value property. And the reason why this works is because under the hood, Vue is using proxies to wrap whatever is passed to ref. So when you call dot value, you're actually triggering the listeners to this bit of state, and those listeners then go and update the relevant nodes, the virtual nodes within Vue, right? So these are two pretty different mechanisms for building a library within these frameworks, right? Usually what you might do within React is you might do like const use form, and then you can like maybe have an initial value, and then you might say something like, you know, like initial value and validators. And then you can say like, you know, any of the logic that lives in here. I'm blanking on how I would implement this right now. But the idea is then you would say const form equals use form. And you might return like an on change here. Right? You might have values, which has, like test 1, 2, 3. Why is that causing? Oh, because I don't have the comma there. So now you might bind this and you might say something along the lines of like input form.values.test. And then on change is form.value or form.onChange. Like that might be how you build this within React, right? And of course, you spend more time implementing this, you add validators, so on and so forth. Right? But then if you wanted to port that same code to Vue, you'd have to switch from using their use state, use hooks, whatever, to using the API available to Vue, which is ref or whatnot, right? On top of that, the way that these mechanisms work to detect and trigger re-renders are fundamentally different, right? You have explicit function calls, you have mutations in Angular, you have proxies in Vue, in Solid you have signals, you have you have compile time differences in Svelte, you have like so many different options at your disposal. So what if we wanted to support multiple frameworks? Well, I would suggest we could maybe take out the re-rendering mechanism, be able to track state outside of a component, and then find a way to inject that back into the component system, right? If we could do that, it would allow us to be able to build an agnostic system that could then support multiple frameworks, and we just inject how they do their change mechanisms. So this is where I'm going to introduce you to our solution to that, called TanStack Store. Now, TanStack Store has a really basic premise with a bit of a more complex background. So right now we have support for React, Vue, and Solid. That may be a hint of what's coming to Solid forms. But the idea is you create a store, right, with like a simple object here of cats and dogs. You then use the store, right? And that's it. You can also set the store. You can say, hey, I want to update this animal, right? So key of cats or dogs. I want to preserve the rest of the state, and I want to add one to the previous number. So then you can say something along the lines of like, hey, when I update cats or dogs, go ahead and check if that value has changed using a selector, and only re-render this component when the localized state of count has changed. If count hasn't changed, don't re-render this component. Otherwise, re-render this specific component. Now, this may seem a little magic at first, but truthfully, it's just JavaScript. We're going to look at the source code here. Like, there's nothing super special. It works the way that some other frameworks and libraries work under the hood. And the source code is surprisingly straightforward once you get the hang of it. So here's an example of how we use this in vanilla JavaScript, right? So we have the idea of a .state variable. We have the ability to add subscriptions. Sorry, my IDE is taking a second. There we go. So these are our tests. Inside of our tests, we have a subscription, which is a VI function or a VTest function. We subscribe to the changes. When we set the state, we expect the subscription to have been called once or twice. And if we aren't listening, then any set states won't be called. We also have the ability to do something like batching updates, right? So here, if we call set state 4 times, but we batch those updates, then our listener will only be called once. So we're not just spamming our subscriptions with events. But if we don't batch our updates, then all 4 updates will be passed to the listener all 4 times. So we can see that it goes from 1 to 5, right? That's all the functionality. And the source code is less than 100 lines long, right? So the idea in vanilla JavaScript, if you ignore all the TypeScript here, is basically saying, hey, when we create the state, go ahead and set the initial value, set any options you might have. Maybe you don't have any. And then set state goes ahead and takes the previous state, passes it to an update function, which is optional. We can ignore priority. I don't think we're using it. And then for each, once it updates the state, right? So this.state equals value. Go ahead and find any listeners that you might have and run them, right? Execute them. You also have the ability to do subscriptions, right? That's as simple as adding a function to the listener. And then when the subscription returns a function that lets you unsubscribe. And finally, we have the ability to batch updates, which basically just says, hey, set this variable to true, and then set it to false when you're all done. And in the meantime, anything that runs in between those two states, invoke it immediately, right? That's really all store does. If we look at if we look at React Store, it uses something called the use sync external store with selector, which is a bit of a weird, hard to explain API. But luckily, our Vue API is a little more straightforward. And what that does is it says, hey, we have a slice of data, which runs the selector function over the whole store. We then watch for any changes to the store. And if there are any changes made, we are going to subscribe to said store, check if the data is the same between the selectors and the previous value. If it is the same, we don't need to re-render. But if it differs, then go ahead and update the dot value and return it as a read-only slice so that the user can't mutate the values. And shallow is literally just checking if they're the same object, checking if they have the same keys. That's it. It's 100% of the store implementation. Using this, we can do stuff like our view test, which says, hey, I have a store outside of a component, use it in the component, and once it's used in the component, go ahead and allow us to update state and listen for state changes. So pretty powerful. Any questions so far before I move on to how we integrate that into form?
Yeah, I got a quick question.
Yeah.
How I understand declaring instance of the store outside, calling to update it. How then do changes in the store get how does the listener reflect the changes to the store back in the component?
Yeah, let's take a look at that bit of code a little more specifically. So if we look at the Vue source store, right? The core is the JavaScript agnostic part that just has a listener, right? But an example, like let's look at what an example of the React store might look like if we didn't have use sync external, right? So here, let me port the Vue code pretty similarly. We might have something that looks like this, where it's like const slice equals use state of selector store.state. So remember, anytime that I call use state here, it's going to go ahead and re-render the component in its parent. Whether or not I use the data in slice or not, if I'm using use store and this is called, it'll re-render, right? So then I can say use effect. Oops. I can say that. Actually, let's do this. Const unsub. What's this? Unsub. And there we go. Oops, hang on. Actually, I'm going to change this to be a little bit more readable, even though technically GPT had it the first time. So if you're familiar with React, right? Set slice is going to re-render, right? And we're listening to the subscription inside of a use effect, which will clean up, run the first render, whatever, right? Yeah. And the first render will start the subscription, check if the state is different, and if the state is different, it'll set the state, which will then re-render the component. So,
yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. Awesome. Good stuff. Now, here's a pattern that I didn't explicitly mention, but should be mentioned all the same. If I am, so store, TanStack store, the vanilla JavaScript version, is framework agnostic, right? But what that means is that you could use it in tandem with the React use store to create a framework agnostic API. So for example, if we, instead of having a use store outside of the component, what if we put it inside of the component, right? But the problem is now this reinitializes every render, right? So what if we just said use store or use state, but we never reinitialized the value. We just assigned it once, right? So here, that's perfectly valid. That code works 100% of the time exactly as it would before. The only difference is that we move the reactivity system from outside of React back inside of React, kind of recreating a reactivity loop using 100 lines of code of JavaScript and a little tiny wrapper around it using React, right? And ta-da, we've suddenly formed the basis of TanStack Form, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to show you the React version of TanStack Form, and then we'll work our way back to the TanStack Form core, which runs in vanilla JavaScript. So like before, we have this is a lot more code, so please stop me if any of this is looking like really scary or frustrating or whatever. But the idea is we have a use state, right? You can think of Form API as a wrapper around Form store or a TanStack store with a little bit of extra stuff. But the idea, if we ignore all the rest of the extra fancy stuff we're doing, is we create a new version of it. We return it and we never re-render it. We listen for changes to the store so that it re-renders. And then boom, like we keep it in sync and then we return it, right? Like the rest of this is just like TypeScript and magic, like stuff that's needed to run the show, but isn't the actual like core part of this, right? We then have use field, which you guessed it, does something real similar. First thing it does is it checks if we are inside of a form.provider. We then do some magic with indexing, which is a feature for the future. We then create a new field API, which has its own store that we listen to. We mount to listens for side effects, and then that's it. Like y'all could go home now. Like I'm going to talk more, but like that's 100% of what you need to know to get a framework agnostic library up and running. All right. So I said I'd talk a little bit more, I suppose. But the idea is that the form core looks a little something like this, where we have a constructor that sets up here. Sorry, I have that minimized. We have a constructor that sets up the store with the default value. We listen for an update. So this is kind of like a global listener. Anytime any state changes, regardless of whether we are batching or not, this on update should run. And here we are saying to get the state, create some derived values, like is the field valid based on the other field's inputs? Can we submit based on, whatever else, right? We then have some validation mechanisms, right? So we say, hey, for each of the field instances, run the field, like run some stuff. You know what I mean? We then, run the validate function for each of these fields. That's what I was looking for. I was like losing my mind, felt like my brain was melting. We also have handling submissions. We have getting field values, like just in case we're missing them. But other than that, like all these are just helper utilities after that. We also have something similar with a field API. So here in our field API constructor, we check to see if there's a form that's passed. We then create a store with an initial value of metadata and values. We then run our derived state on every update. We also have a mount to run side effects, keep track of other derived state, like what's an example here? Like if you update metadata or value, and you update that at the form level, the field value will be tracked, right? Then we have our set value, which literally just says, hey, tell the form that the value has changed and then go validate. Our validation logic is pretty straightforward. It basically just says run our synchronous validation, right? So where is it coming from? Are we running on change? Or are we running on submit? then run the validation with our validators if there are any. Otherwise, run the function itself, set any errors if there are any. And then once synchronous validation is done, we do the whole thing all over again, just with asynchronous validation. And yeah, we also have our Vue adapters, right? So we can look at here and we can say, again, create a field API, because setup functions only run once. Once the field API is created, go ahead and mount when the component is mounted and run cleanup when it's unmounted. Watch to listen for options that we need to pass back to the field API. And we'll do the same thing with form, where we create a new form API that is instantiated once on setup. We then listen and update, and then re-renders everything for us. So, yeah, that is the foundation of TanStack Form, and like 90% of the code to get you there. I realize I kind of blazed through this one. Usually the talk goes a little bit longer. But what can I help answer? What does anyone want to look at? Happy to walk through it.
Is it possible to see an example in React where you're just using an HTML form, and then you got to make a couple of fields, a couple of validators? Is that something you could show what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, this is it, right? So we have our HTML form, right? We prevent default and stop propagation so that it doesn't refresh the page.
Yeah.
And then we have our on-change validator, our asynchronous validator, which we could literally like replace with like a fetch here.
Gotcha. Question, just to go back up 10 or 20 lines. So you're in form provider. What is that doing?
Form provider, I'm spacing because I've not had to touch that bit of code for a bit. What does form context do again? I know that it exists. Why does it exist? I think it's just a convenience for us as maintainers. Let me double check. Hang on.
Like, is that something that's necessary? Do I have to use form provider?
You do, yeah. But the question is why? Because we have it inside a field. I think I know why. I think this is so that we can... No, that doesn't make any sense, because form, use field.
There must be
use
some
field
context.
allows us to be able to use context.
Yeah,
I think this is so that this was originally called form, like form.form, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We renamed it to form.provider because we didn't want people to add an on submit or an on anything here.
Sure.
But the idea is that it's what is actually powering form.field. Even though we have this relationship, if you look at this, the logic for use form, we don't mutate field in any way. Like, we don't recreate field every time and pass. Like, we could theoretically do something like this. Right? Where we're props, and then we pass form as API here, right? We could theoretically do something like this, but then our ability to, like, we want to be able to allow people to nest their forms into different locations. So, like, let's say that you have a form that's really, really big and you want to be able to nest it a couple layers deep. Context is how we're enabling that. Although, truth be told, the reason why I'm so hesitant about this answer is that we do have the relationship, and it might make sense to just remove that wholesale, because I know that context does not play nice with Next.js's stuff. So you'd have to client render it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stay tuned. We might remove that. Stay tuned.
It would be a cleaner API without wrapping in a provider, if that was possible.
Yeah, we might be able to, because I don't think this provider is doing a ton for us right now. It's definitely not required by the... I'm actually meeting with Tanner next week sometime. I'm going to bring this up with him as a potential to remove. So,
got it. And where form, so use form, so we're in the component app, call use form. give it some default values. Then
And these are optional.
got it. Yeah, it could be, if we fetch some data that was previously saved, then that would be the default values.
Yep.
Then on submit, I get it. You call the on submit from the handler from the form. They came back to
Exactly.
the form.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's so that it can do its submission validation and any validation it needs to.
And then form.field, that's a component that is part of the library and is necessary as part of the library.
Yes, but, and this is really important, it's 100% headless, meaning that day one, this supports React Native. That's why we're able to build it into Vue. It'll support NativeScript. Excuse me. It'll support Ionic, like any runtime that you can think of that React runs in, this will support.
Okay.
We don't require the DOM at all.
Thanks.
Yeah. Does anyone want to learn about how I do this with TypeScript, like how TypeScript works for this project?
Yes.
Okay. So we're doing a lot with TypeScript here. Like arguably, like Nolan, have me back for a second talk about how type inferencing works. Don't make it soon because I will have to actually write this talk and actually like focus on it.
Done, and you're off the hook. I have speakers booked through January, so you got some time.
Yes, cool. But yeah, so the gist of it is something that we had to learn the hard way, is that TypeScript really doesn't like to infer values that it can't reason about. That sentence sounds really obvious, like I can't hear words that aren't spoken to me. Like that seems obvious, right? What's not always obvious is what the boundary between runtime and type behavior is. So for example, if we look at the field API here, right? And we look at the class, you'll notice that we have a lot of generics, right? But you notice how there's this equal sign here, right? What this is saying is that we want to extend this value and assign it to a default value if nothing is explicitly passed. This is awesome because it means that if you don't pass a value, TypeScript is able to infer what you mean, unless you do this. Okay. So I just did this, right? Now this assignment value will not be inferred at all, and instead will be as broad of a type as possible without type narrowing. Because I'm explicitly passing type parameters, I would need to repass this type parameter in order to narrow that type based down on usage. So that's cool. That's a fun time. Additionally, let's say that I don't have a generic here, like I leave out form validator, but I do have a type value up here that is optional, like I leave it as equals unknown. Same thing. That will always be unknown because I'm not passing it from the runtime into the type system. And because I'm not making that inference, it just blows up and goes, I don't know what you're doing. So what we're doing is we pass a lot of generics, right? Which is the form type. So for example, like ABC123. We pass the name, which is ABC, like the name of the field. We pass the validator type. So yup validator, Zod validator, etc. We then pass, if the form has a validator type, what is it? And then finally, we pass T data, which is the data type constructed from the parent and the name, right? So ABC123, ABC name would result in a T data of 123, right? The value of the keys deeply nested from the parent. So you can even, if you look at like deep value, our types get really crazy here. Don't mind this file. But basically what this crazy wackiness allows you to do is even type syntax or dot syntax. So within your dot notation, you could say ABC dot def dot hij, and it'll get those values from an object within the dot notation. So a lot of really cool TypeScript stuff going on here. We then pass those values to the field API options, which adds a form to the field options. But notice that we pass form validator here and nowhere else up here. That's because we're trying to infer the form validator from the form that is passed. So like inside of here, we have our own properties. In this case, it is validator, right? So if validator is defined, it'll be inferred here through this type generic up until the class. Otherwise, it'll infer validator from here, which is part of the field API. We then check to see if there is a field validator. If not, if there is a field validator, we support both the validation function and the validation type, which I'll explain in a second. We then check if there is a form validator, do the same thing there. And if there isn't a field or form validator, then we default to just supporting the function. So I talked a little bit about like the validator type. The validator type is a base class, which is here. Base type, which I wish we had higher kind of types. I'll explain that in another second. But the idea is that our validator defines a validate and a validate async with a type and a function that is not known until type build. We then have our Zod validator, which is shockingly uncomplicated, to quote a TikToker. And what they're doing is they extend this validator type by being in a function that returns validate async and has the function type as Zod type. So it automatically converts this to Zod type, and then that Zod type is able to do whatever it needs to in here. So, and then finally, this is not a feature of TypeScript, but I wish it was, because then I could fix a bug. Right now, if you use Zod validator, actually, let me just show you the test I've already written for this, because I have a test for functionality that it doesn't work because of TypeScript, which is a little extra, ever so slightly extra of me. But the idea is that you can pass a Zod validator, and even though we know the tdata type of name, which is a string of test, we cannot restrict z to z.string. People can pass z.object, z.whatever, and it works, even though it shouldn't work. That'll throw a runtime error. And that is because what we can't do is we can't say something like function equals unknown function type. We can't pass one generic to another generic. If we could do that, this would work instantly, right as intended. So just like you can have higher kinded functions where you pass a function to another function and then return a function from that function, we want to do the same thing here, but TypeScript doesn't have that functionality yet. I realize I flooded everyone with information. I apologize for that. Again, happy to do another round of questions, or even if it's not about TanStack Form directly, even if it's like, I don't know, coding and related.
I'll probably watch it later on YouTube to fill in gaps if I need to.
Sounds good.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have a lot of questions because you're above my level right now.
That's okay.
Corbin is above everyone's level. You are not alone in that, sir.
I'm like, I don't even know where to start. So,
well, if you were gonna say you'd be bored by it, which I like, just like inferencing based on like how you started that sentence, like I wouldn't be. I love teaching people, and in fact, one of the things that I'm doing, I'm going to link this in chat because I'm a shameless self-promoter. Is I'm writing a book called the Framework Field Guide that teaches React, Angular, and Vue all at the same time for free. It'll be out soon. I promise soon. Yeah, so teaches React, Angular, and Vue from the very basics of like what is a component all the way to, in the third book when I'm done with it, like how do you write a framework from scratch.
Nice. Yeah. So is this related to Isn't TanStack for what, a React query?
React Query turned into TanStack Query, like
Okay.
just a rename.
Okay.
But they support React, Solid, Vue, Svelte. So that's helmed by Tanner, and I can always remember his handle, can't remember his name. TK Dodo. Why, man, I'm gonna meet Dominic. I'm gonna meet him one day and I'm gonna be like, hi, persons whose name I can't remember. Yeah. Dominic is legendary maintainer. If I can do a 10th of what I'm doing with what we're doing with TanStack Form, with what he's doing with query, we're going to be just fine. Even a 10th of it.
Nice. Yeah, seems awesome.
Yeah.
Corbin, a question. Now you mentioned TanStack query. There isn't a dependency between the forms and query, right? Forms are kind of standalone library.
Yeah. Let me show you the 100% of our dependencies. So I'm going to start with React Form just to show you there's no magic. React Form has a actual dependency on the form core, React store, React TanStack store, layout effect, which is literally like an 8-line of code dependency. And then of course, form core has a dependency on TanStack store, right? And then TanStack store React has a dependency on use sync external source store, which I believe is a React official package. And again, super tiny. And TanStack store, which has no dependencies whatsoever. So a total of like 4 dependencies, and all of them except for 2 are owned by us. So we are as close to 0 dependencies as you can reasonably get with production.
If I may, I do have a question regarding Zod and the integration. Like I've come across Zod, at the edge with, generating TypeScript and also validating API integrations. Recently seen it for form validations too. So you have an integration that can use a Zod schema to do form validation. Could you show a little bit more about that if you have?
Yeah. So we, like, let's say that you have a schema, right, which is a whole object, right? The challenge is that we don't have a whole schema validator, right? We're kind of considering it, but to be honest, I don't really see the need, because what you can do instead is you can add them field by field here, right? So you can say schema.shape.firstname run on change. Now, this seems a little bit more verbose. You have to have one property per field, right? And it's like, like that's kind of annoying. But what it allows you to do is it allows you to do your validation on a per field, but not just per field, but per validation type basis. So you can say that I want to validate this field on blur, this field on change, this field on submit, and this field on mount. And that's a lot of flexibility that comes basically for free.
Got it. So in this case with Zod, you're defining your field validation rules in your schema,
right?
And then using them in the form, integrating with form.field to use the validations from the schema. Yeah.
Exactly. And we support yep the exact same way. So like if you want to see yep examples, here we go. Yep.string. We're going to probably support Valibot before version 1. And if anyone wants to build any adapters, let us know. We'd be happy to make them official. So, Obi, you had your hand raised earlier?
Yeah, sorry.
You're good.
Is there any benefit to just getting into the TanStack ecosystem as a whole? Because there's a lot of solutions for this query, this form, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. I want to make, so let me put it this way. If you think I'm doing an okay job with form, and you think that TanStack query is doing a good job with query, go look at like Kevin's project of TanStack table, or Router, which is maintained by Tanner himself. And what you'll find is like, one, there's it's a healthy community. Tanner does a lot to support all the packages, but also like really provide a lot of support for us as maintainers of these packages. And they tend to have a similar philosophy of like headless, type safe, like really powerful. I realize I didn't even mean to copy this. That's hilarious. But the idea is that you can use them in really any environment, not have to worry about TypeScript so much. And you can usually use them with multiple frameworks, right? So like TanStack Table supports Vue and I don't know where, yeah, Vue and Solid and Svelte and vanilla JavaScript and a bunch of other stuff, right? So like that's really powerful on its own to be able to be like, hey, I have a large company. We all want to standardize on one set of tooling, TanStack, right? I think that there are like kind of insider baseball. I think that there are room for us to grow as an ecosystem. So for example, like Table differs from Query in their docs, right? Like the reason why I was looking up in the corner is because notice how there's a framework here. There's not a framework here, right? Even though they clearly support multiple different frameworks. I think that there's a lot of docs that are like yet to be there. Like if we look at like virtual, you can see that virtual doesn't have like coming soon for Solid or Svelte, you know. And I'm totally guilty of that too. This is not like me picking on any of the maintainers in particular. Like Form is inarguably the absolute worst one of them all, right? Like there's nothing here basically. Like if you literally go to Vue and then you go, let's see, like if you go to like field API, it literally tells you to go read the source code, right? So one of the things that I want to do as a newer maintainer of TanStack Form is I want to work on creating a version 1 of TanStack Form. And from there, I want to work on all of our ecosystem packages to really create a lot of homogeny between the quality and the documentation and the overall experience of using a TanStack project. So that's to say, we have good things. There are good reasons for using them. Expect those reasons to get better. And if you'd like to be part of helping making that better, let me know, because we're always looking for contributors and we will do anything we can to support you.
Yeah, I might take you up on that. That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, 100%.
Kind of on a quasi-related note, earlier this week, I got a pull request approved for adding documentation to a different open source project. My entire pull request was deleting one character and hitting save. That fixed a link in part of the documentation that was busted. So if you are thinking about contributing to something that Corbin's talking about and you feel like, oh my God, I don't even know where to start, you can start with simple, small things like proof the docs that are there and fix typos. And that'll be a way to just begin contributing. You do not have to start with writing all of the Svelte examples. Start with typos, then you can go from there.
Yeah, 100%.
Corbin, I have one question for you that's slightly off topic whenever you're done with the main question from the folks here.
Yeah, I was going to say the last thing to add on to what Nolan was saying is that like we tend to think of maintainers as like these like above us, like oh, they're working on the tools we use, we can't touch them, we can't whatever, right? And I think that's an absolute silly notion. If you see something wrong with TanStack Form, you have questions, even DM me. I don't care if it's on Twitter, Discord, anything like that. Like get in touch. I'm happy to answer questions, happy to consult, anything in between.
Corbin, I have another question, which is kind of like stepping back a little.
Yeah.
Forms been around a long time, since the beginning of the web, et cetera, et cetera. Like why, what sparks your interest about that? Of all the things you could be doing, like why mundane, crappy, been there, done that forms?
Yeah.
This is a leading question, but
no, it's totally leading questions. I love this one though, because I was expecting you to end this question with like, what makes you different from all the other tools, which I can answer to. But why work on crappy, mundane forms? For what it's worth, I agree with you. Forms are kind of boring at the surface. You know what I mean? You're like, oh wow, you keep track of state and then you represent it somehow. Wow, complex engineering going on here, folks. Um, but one, let me give a little bit of a history lesson. I'm actually the original author of House Form, which is a different form library that I'm looking to deprecate in favor of TanStack Form. And it's production ready. We're using it at my work for our actual forms. And it was born out of a difference of thought. I wrote an article about why I like Formic and why I chose to abandon it in favor of my own tool. And the TLDR is that Formic at the time was mostly unmaintained and had some issues with TypeScript, had some issues, just like some API things that I wasn't a huge fan of. And then took a look at React Hook Form, which is also like, again, these tools are wonderful. Like they have great maintainers. They have even Formic came back with new maintainers and is doing a lot of good stuff. React Final Form is still, like a really good API. But none of them were quite the API I was looking for, right? Like I had this idea in my head that House Form and TanStack Form are pretty close to, if not there, right? And I was like, how long could this possibly take, right? Like I'll just knock this out in a day. A week passes. I have a version 1 of House Form, and it works okay. And as I started working more on forms, the more complexities showed up, right? Like the end goal for me is like, how there's the stepper component, which allows you to have like, boom, something like this. Oh, if we can build this soon, that'd be beautiful.
Yeah, we built that.
Right. And wasn't it a pain in the butt?
Yep.
Like, didn't you have to eject out of a bunch of stuff and manually keep track of state? And then you had to, it's a nightmare, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to show you what API we came up with for House Form that I expect to see in TanStack Form by the end of next year, maybe. I say that hesitantly, but look at this API. You have a form, you have a field, and you have a form group. The form group has its own submission, right? You have a form that allows you to do like HTML forms, progressive enhancement, the whole lot. And then you just choose to preserve state. Like you tell it to preserve state when it's unrendered. That's it. That's 100% of what you need to build that. And that is the motivating factor, is that building some of these really complex forms seem really straightforward at first. And then you start working with it and you start building things and you're like, come on, we've had forms for like 40 years. We've had that like in computers alone, like ignoring, like they were the very first use case of computers, basically. Like, what are we doing? You know what I mean?
Totally.
So there's a lot of motivation behind trying to be as powerful, but as straightforward as a solution for forms as I possibly can. And it became a fun engineering challenge, truthfully. Like getting that TypeScript inferencing stuff to work is tough. It's fun, but it's tough.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Nolan, you had something for me?
I did. Does anyone else have actual related questions to ask before I derail this meeting?
I guess last one, just as like I said, maybe a naive question, but how does like something that like this where so many put time into it, what's like, how does it make money, or how does it yeah, I guess all these free tools like this, I'm just curious, is it just for the good of all developers?
So that's the fun part. You don't make money. I'm gonna get on a bit of a soapbox here, because I was just ranting about this to my friend yesterday. I love doing this work, right? So before anything else, I love doing it. And if I didn't believe in open source, my GitHub graph wouldn't look like this, and I wouldn't be writing a book that has this at the end of it. It just wouldn't happen, right? So yes, I am motivated by seeing tools that I build used in production at larger organizations that like fuels me. It makes me excited. I like being able to help other developers. There's people behind the screens that we interact with, and being able to make their lives easier is always a plus. Especially with educational stuff like that. That is just sheerly like, I came from family that didn't make a lot of money, and I want to help other people be able to improve their lives through tech, right? But that all said, I don't have a monetization strategy. And because I don't have a monetization strategy, I'm not starting the form company number 3, and because I don't have a monetization strategy, I'm going to spend hundreds of hours working on forms that will make companies thousands of dollars, minimum of thousands of dollars. And I'm not going to see a dime of it. And I'm not the only one, right? Like what is the KCD or ex-KCD comic of single point of failure? Is this it? Yeah. Like all modern infrastructure, some random project in Nebraska that has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003, right? Like that's true. Like we think about it, but it's true. Like the example I love to bring up is Josh Goldberg. Josh is an amazing human being. If he sees this, he's going to DM me and be like, hi, thank you, because he's wonderful like that. But he maintains TypeScript ESLint and a ton of other TypeScript developer tooling. And for real, if you like have corporate funding, please go give this guy money, because he's working full time on this project. And he's making, like, he's talked about it publicly a couple times, he's making something close to minimum wage, I think, which is crazy, because without this one person, like 90% of the TypeScript developer tooling ecosystem just dies. It's just gone. Like he's not getting funded by Microsoft. He's talking with the Microsoft team. Like it's crazy how much work Josh does on a daily basis. And he's like basically not getting paid for it. And I think that there is something wrong with the way we fund open source today. There's something inherently and intrinsically flawed with the system we have in place in order to build this type of tooling for others. So I don't have an answer for you. I wish I had an answer for you, because if I did, I'd help fix it for all the maintainers out there.
Can I jump in with a couple real quick things on that,
Yeah.
Corbin? First, Corbin, add a link to your Amazon wish list, or a link to like a buy me a coffee account for you, or anything like that, to your pages. And I don't think anyone would fault you or judge you for doing anything of the sort if you wanted to have a donate to the cause button up there. Similarly, I think, and this is a whole other conversation. Maybe we should do a roundtable discussion on it sometime for a future meetup. There's also obviously the path a lot of folks go with is professional open source. So you still get the value of supporting communities, giving code back to developers and organizations that have fewer resources available for whatever reason, and they can still use the stuff for free. And then you have the ability to work with the larger organizations that maybe want to use your library and need training on it for a new team, or they need new features added to it so they can actually build their multi-million-dollar app, whatever it is. Then you get the nice balance too of the app is free. If billionaire company XYZ calls and says, please add these features, you can go, I will absolutely add those features. Here is the dollar amount we need donated to get that done in a timely fashion for you. Or you can just wait until we get done with it at X number of months in the future. And there's always options like that to consider too for contributing to do things. I don't think it solves all of the money problems, but I don't think anyone would fault you if you had a link to some sort of donate thing on the different pages here, because you're clearly putting a lot of work into sites, as is Josh, as are hundreds upon hundreds of other open source contributors all over the place.
For sure. My point is more like we have to do better as a community to be aware that, we should support the ecosystem as a whole.
Oh, for sure.
So, but definitely agree. Like consulting, if great example, if anyone here uses TanStack Form and it's like, hey, we love it, we got to get it out tomorrow, call me.
Right. Are you going to be at SecTech Social next week?
Yes. Let's
make sure we block off time and chat there, because I have some ideas I want to talk to you about in this area. But I don't want to make all these poor, unfortunate souls sit here for another 3 hours while we yammer on about other things.
Right. Yeah, sounds good.
I did have one other question for you, though. Different topic, though. Just out of curiosity, why WebStorm instead of, say, VS Code or Sublime or something?
Oh, yeah.
What is WebStorm doing for you?
It does one thing and one thing only. You see this?
This, what is this?
That dot value. It brought me exactly to the React types for dot value.
I think my screen is not refreshing as fast as you're able to talk. So,
gotcha. So like here, right? Like you see children.
I
right?
see children. Yep, you're highlighted.
If
Children.
I control click on it,
Yeah,
it'll bring me to the TypeScript types that for my library that
Okay.
is talking about children. And that is a feature that does exist in VS Code. It doesn't work like 9/10 of the time.
interesting. Okay.
So.
So it's more TypeScript friendly
Yeah.
Okay. For
I
core
don't know.
library development.
Yeah. And the other thing is I've just gotten used to it, truthfully.
Fair enough.
And I don't know. I can use
Alright.
VS Code if I need to, but it's just not my preference.
Fair enough. I was just curious what this does for, and that answered my question. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for yet another excellent presentation, my friend.
Anytime.
It's always fantastic to have you come present and drop large amounts of knowledge bombs on everybody here. You've got some thank yous and kudos and things in the chat as well from Dennis, and other folks dropping in now too. Does anyone else have one last question for Corbin before we sign off?
Nope, but thank you, man.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for hanging out with us. Again, if you want to be notified about future meetings, you can go to sackinteractive.com and we'll let you know when the next meetup is happening. It'll be the third Wednesday of the month here in Zoom until I get a new in-person location set up for Sacramento. And then we'll just record the meetings and put them online after the fact for folks similar to how we're doing it now. Corbin, thank you again. Really appreciate it.